Thank you very much, Chjango, for that introduction. Hello, my name is Zach Vorhies. I'm known as the Google Whistleblower. And today I want to talk to you guys about what exactly Google was doing with its machine learning fairness, why they were doing it, and why we have to decentralize from centralized sources of power in order to assert our sovereignty. With that, I want to get into how we fix censorship. I've got a unique view on this. This is something that I've been obsessed with because, as Plato said, those who tell the stories rule the world. And there's no one better to rule the world than you, the people. And so today I'm going to be talking about how to decentralize our voices. And this is something that I've actually been working on for about the last year. And so this isn't just something that I've come up with sitting idly around. This is something that I'm actively developing as a software engineer. And so I'm leaking out the secrets because once the product comes out, I feel that there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be copying me. And I hope that that is the way that happens because I want to be a trendsetter. So with that, let's get into it. And the topic of the speech is, how do we fix censorship? This is a big problem. So one of the critical things is, how exactly does Google censor? Well, they had this censorship algorithm called machine learning fairness. It is essentially machine learning, which, as some of you know, is a gradient descent algorithm that takes a bunch of training data and then figures out how close novel input is to the training data that it has seen in the past, and then figures out what sort of decisions to take. Essentially, the addition of fairness onto machine learning fairness indicates that it's a type of machine learning whose goals are to enforce social justice values onto the internet. This was something that Google promised that they wouldn't do when they launched their IPO. They specifically said that they were going to do no evil, and more importantly than that, their second mission statement was to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. I believe that the application of censorship directly contradicts that mission statement. I believe also that it's an existential threat to humanity, and that leftism, as it was practiced in Google, is essentially not a tolerant ideology. It's one that is almost like a religion, is the closest thing that I can think of it. You either agree with it or you're excluded from political, scientific, and other debates. So what is the goal here? Well, as Google has said in numerous slides within the company, people are programmed, and it's a four-step process. First off, training data are collected and classified, algorithms are programmed, media are ranked, filtered, and aggregated, and then people like us are programmed. And you may think, well, maybe this is just one engineer's opinion, dude, but as I discovered, this existed in other places as well. This is what they refer to as a generalized filter bubble. And as you can see, the same process is applying here. The end step is people are programmed. And the more I thought about this, the more I realized that this was true. It turns out that all of our opinions are contained within the available information that we have access to. And if we have access to it, then it sort of forms our Overton window. And what Google's wanting to do is they want to take that Overton window and they want to shift it and gradually shift it using incrementalism so that society as a whole can come up to a manufactured consensus of a new norm. And in order to do that, they decided that they had to rewrite their news algorithms. And what better model to use than the direct politics that were happening at the day. So as many of you will remember, Trump and Comey had this fight. Well, as an insider, I saw Google literally rewrite its news algorithms in real time in order to try to hurt a president, a sitting president. You may not like Trump. I definitely think that he's got a lot of rough spots. I'm not a big fan, but I don't think that a giant company with a monopoly should rewrite their news algorithms in order to target a person that they don't like. So this was, so they were also doing it for, the Paris Agreement, climate change. And I want to just kind of give you a look of kind of a high level view of exactly how Google is able to manipulate the news, right? They literally have a thing called hive mind. That hive mind system right here is, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not. That is a thing that is detecting signals out of the noise. Like if you could imagine all the news is a haystack, then what Google is doing is they're trying to find the needles in that haystack, and they're trying to figure out what they want to boost up and what they want to suppress. What do they want to suppress? Well, in my time, I saw that they really, really didn't like anything that contradicted the pharmaceutical cartels. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to take their competition, which was independent entrepreneurs, and they wanted to put the thumbs on the scale. They wanted to demonetize them. They wanted to tank their organic search results. And as you can see here in Self-Hacked, he was a very popular blogger. And then one day, traffic goes down. And then he's able to get it back up. And then it goes down, and then down again, and then down again. And then it is what it is. This is Marcola. He was named by Biden specifically as someone spreading vaccine misinformation. And one day he lost 99% of his traffic. This should terrify everyone and is the most stinging indictment against centralization of power we have ever seen. Additionally, Google had this thing called a YouTube query blacklist, and most of it was centered around the Las Vegas massacre and various searches that people were doing to try to uncover false flag attacks. It's absolutely insane. If there's anything you should watch in my disclosure, it's the YouTube query blacklist. It's absolutely mind-blowing. And what I also noticed, since we're on the theme of health, that they were blacklisting cancer cure and the cure for cancer. This made me realize that there was really something nefarious going on. And that's when I discovered that there's actually a whole bunch of different cancer cures. The ones that are allowed to make it onto the Google search index are pretty much fake. The big ones, if you know anyone who's got cancer, is B17, which occurs naturally in dried apricot seeds, and then another thing called GC-MAF, which the FDA has been aggressively trying to destroy, the UK as well. MAF stands for macrophage activating factor, and GC is a glycoprotein. So it's a thing that they refine from blood and then they inject into you, or you can inject into yourself, and it really just destroys cancer. And the UK and the United States has gone out of their way to make it as legal as possible. In fact, the guy who figured it all out by the name of something Bradstreet, he was found in a river with 2 shots to the chest, and it was ruled a suicide. Check it out. It's Jeff Bradstreet is his name. And then when he died, the Washington Post, I believe, was dancing on his grave, saying that he was someone peddling in misinformation. So, there, if you want to see something, go down this rabbit hole of GC-MAF and B17. Maybe you'll save someone that you love. I certainly told everyone about this on my Twitter, and I had a few people reach out with cancer and said that this had shrunk their tumors like within a couple weeks. So it's really a crime against humanity that YouTube would be sitting there and saying, "Oh, you can't search for this at all." Since my disclosure, this YouTube query blacklist has gone away. A lot of these search terms are now searchable again. And look, they also don't want you to find supplements. And they also have their social justice search terms embedded into, the YouTube's Google search engine. You can do this today. Go to google.com and type in men can, do a space, and let it autocomplete and see what it autocompletes to today. Do the same thing for women can. And ask yourself, why is Google doing this? Why does Google have a fight in these social justice terms? Like, shouldn't it just provide value to the customer? Well, they don't think so. So YouTube is no good. They're outsourcing a lot of their censorship to the likes of the ADL and the SLPC. I'm not a fan of either of those companies. I think that they traffic in hate themselves and that they are defamation laundering engines. And YouTube has decided that these are going to be the people that police your speech online. And they're the ones that are defining what hate is and what is acceptable discourse. So how do we fix the censorship problem? This is a really big problem, right? Because if you can upload a video and mention vaccines, or you can mention crypto and it's going to get banned, well, that's a big existential problem to our movements. We need to be able to have democratic movements in order to have innovation, right? That's what innovation is. People coming together, finding out new ways of doing things that are better than the ways they've done before. And whenever they do that, they're going to be challenging established power centers. And so in order for us to be able to do that now and into the future, we need to be able to figure out how do we amplify each other. And it turns out that there is a really simple format. And we need to be able to figure out how we're going to integrate this with crypto, how we're going to be able to use this with blockchain. And that is essentially RSS. It's an XML feed similar to HTML. It's very, 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 very simple. And it's being used all over the web today in order to syndicate video. It wasn't designed for video. It was designed for blogcasts, but people have been able to write their little schema extensions and be able to use it. And now what we see is YouTube, Brighteon, BitChute, Odyssey, Spreaker, and CloudHub are all organizations that are using this RSS feed in order to broadcast, hey, this is what the content creator has published. Here's the title. Here's some keywords. Here's a link to the video itself. And from that, we can actually, route around the entire censorship. Now, there's actually two forms of censorship that YouTube is employing today. And one of those is straight up removal of videos, right? And I include demonetization within that removal. And then the second way is they allow the video to actually go on their video hosting site, but then, well, it gets shadow banned or it doesn't get put into the recommendation engine. And so that recommendation engine is the thing that I want to talk about, because this is what the RSS feeds are going to enable. We already have the video hosting problem totally nailed down, right? Like, you as a content creator have a plethora of choices. You can publish on Rumble, you can publish on BitChute, you can publish on Brighteon. And all of these video sources are great. They're fast, they work well, they're reliable. They now support quality video formats and video streaming rates. And they're free. I mean, how can you get any better than that? And they allow you to monetize now. But the problem right now is we still don't have the recommendation engine that is fair and free, because all the different recommendation engines on all these little platforms are all internal. They only recommend their content. They don't recommend someone else's content. See where I'm going here? So why aren't we all using RSS right now? Well, actually we are, which I said before. Rumble's still a little bit behind the curve, but I think with a little pressure, they'll start publishing their public format and their own implementation of RSS. This is what it looks like. It's an RSS. It's a XML-like feed. With Spreaker here, you can see that they have iTunes Author. That's because RSS doesn't have built into it a lot of these different categories and different, what are they called, attribution names. And so they're using these schema extensions in order to get the names that they want. It's a minor challenge. I mean, the great thing about this is I can write a parser that can get this RSS feed in about an hour, right? And whenever someone does something, I just copy and paste it. And then it's like 15 minutes once I've already done one RSS feed. I mean, all the others are pretty much almost exactly identical. Here's YouTube's. And the problem about these RSS feeds is that the readers were sabotaged by Google. How? Because Google decided that they were going to go ahead and release their own reader. And the reader was really great. Everyone really loved it. And every single month they got, higher and higher traffic. And people were like, oh, this is wonderful. Thank you, Google. You released this reader, right? And then what did they do? They sabotaged it. They sunsetted it. They destroyed the reader. And as a result, this was after, essentially they deflated the entire RSS reader economy. And then after, they deflated it, they, collapsed it by taking support away from their own reader. And why did it die? We don't know, but we do know that the Chrome RSS also died at the same time. So for whatever reason, it looked like Google really didn't want people to have RSS, right? They wanted to, they wanted everyone to go through their Google News and they wanted them to go through their YouTube, right? And so what do we need to do? So, how did this Google Reader work? I mean, it was very actually simple. They have a spider. The spider goes out and it pulls a lot of different content creators and then puts it into a local database, typically SQLite. And then you just read off that database. And then, periodically it crawls. And when it gets a new, article from one of the places that you follow, it lets you know. And this is really great. This is a decentralized model. This is exactly what we need today. But no one's figured this out yet. Or have they? Right? So Google generates that view. It puts it to, the Google Reader. And what we need to do is we need to be able to recapture that. We already know what works. It's this RSS feed. And the reason why Google wants to kill it is because they know that aggregation defeats their censorship. And it's just as simple as that. Aggregation cancels censorship. And what we need to do as a community, if I may humbly propose, is that we figure out how to take this RSS and bring it into sort of a blockchain format, because it's actually very similar, right? Like you've got a version of someone's stream, and then you can add on additional versions on top of that. You can call them diffs, and almost like a GitHub, or I'm sorry, a Git format, right? Like where you have your base image, and then you add diffs onto that. And then whenever you want to get an update, you can, asynchronously get that update when it comes, and it is eventually consistent with everyone else on the internet. And by eventually consistent, I mean within minutes, right? Like there's an update, it goes through the chain, and then you get the head, and then you add it on, and then boom, you've got the newest update for, all the content of the people that you follow. And so, in my opinion, aggregation defeats censorship, and I intend to start this trend with a product that I will launch very, very soon. And if you guys are interested, go ahead and reach out to me at twitter.com/perpetualmaniac. And if you agree to an NDA, then I will give you a link to a live preview of the site today. And so with that, I open it up to questions.
Well,
I'm sorry. And with that, I open it up to questions.
Sorry, we're not taking questions from the audience just yet.
Okay.
But we can segue to the next section, which is a panel with yourself and Shiv Malik, where I will ask you questions.
I can also continue and tell a little bit about the backstory of how the disclosure sort of happened. I can go ahead and fill in. All right, let's just do that. So, how did this all go down? So a little bit of background about myself. I was a software engineer at Google for 8.5 years. When I left the company, my title was senior software engineer. And look, I was a liberal, or so I thought. I wasn't into conspiracy theories at all. I just laughed at them. I thought, oh, that's just, those people, they're just, suffering from apophrenia. And then something really interesting happened. In 2016, Google had a freakout session with the election of Donald Trump. And I thought that, okay, well, this is just a president. Sometimes the left wins, sometimes they lose, and maybe they'll just allow the loss and then try again in 4 years. But to my utter surprise, Google was not going to do that. They basically had a full-on freakout session, and I remember 1 week after Trump got elected, there was this really famous meeting now that happened with the company. It was an all-hands meeting. And with this meeting, they basically talked about how they were going to undo the Trump situation. And, Breitbart eventually posted this meeting, but one of the things that they didn't center on, which I thought was arguably the most important part of this hour-long meeting, was an audience question, which was, what was the most successful thing that Google had done during the 2016 election? And this was asked to the CEO of the company, Sundar Pichai. And what Sundar Pichai responded was the following, that it was the use of their machine learning in order to censor the internet and fake news that was the most successful. And I went, wait a minute, what? We're censoring the internet? I thought that our mission statement stated that we weren't doing such a thing. And so this sort of led me down into the rabbit hole of essentially, what Google was up to. And I said to myself, well, there's got to be a fake news team if they're defining what fake news is and getting rid of it. So I started to dig in. And Google, mind you, is a fully transparent company. Unlike Apple or the CIA, where everything's siloed and compartmentalized, and you can't ask questions about what your neighbor's working on, Google is the exact opposite of that, or at least they were in 2016. And that was, I could go to any team in the company and I could see what they were working on, their OKRs, their snippets, and see what they were up to. And so I went to the fake news team and I looked at what the fake news team was doing, and I realized that all of the examples in their design documents were basically focused on Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton running weapons to Benghazi in order to arm ISIS. And I had heard this before, and I was like, well, this is something that's really interesting. Maybe it's time for me to become an expert on exactly what's going on. And so I dug in, found out, wow, there's actually, a lot of there. And the there was that there was a weapons trafficking operation to arm ISIS. And we know this because there was a Stinger missile that was fired at a U.S. helicopter operating in the Middle East. It wasn't correctly armed, so the missile bounced off. The military later recovered it, and they went, oh my gosh, this is one of ours. What's happening? They looked at the serial numbers, and they were able to ascertain that it was a bunch of weapons that was given to the CIA. And they're like, hey, how come a weapon we gave to the CIA was given to, ISIS? And that was what the whole email scandal was about, I believe. And so, I started to realize, well, wait a minute, this actually could have not been fake news. This actually could have been something that was true. Why is Google trying to hide this? And so I realized that, okay, well, if we've got a fake news team and they're trying to create this single point of truth that's ubiquitous across the entire platform, then there's got to be something that's going to be censoring all of this news. And so when I went looking and digging into that, I had this assumption that the censorship engine was going to be called Project Dragonfly. You guys may have heard about it. It was going to be the censorship engine that was used in China. And so I went looking for that. And to my surprise, there was absolutely nothing about Project Dragonfly, not a shred of evidence within Google, which is weird because whatever is in Google, there's a paper trail. And for this, there wasn't. But I saw this other thing, which was machine learning fairness. And as soon as I saw that, I went, that is such a clever name, right? Because whenever the left comes up with something, they always give it a clever name so that if you're against it, you're a bad person. And I realized that if I was against machine learning fairness, then I was against, implicitly fairness, right? As they named it. And so I went, okay, this is what I would call the censorship engine. I think this is it. And to my, suspicions, yes, this was it. It had a whole bunch of these subcomponents, Project Purple Rain, real-time boost, real-time events, monitoring of the entire internet, looking for signals out of the noise, and then boosting up the signals that they wanted to have boosted and suppressing it otherwise. The YouTube blacklist, as I showed you. What I and the way that this machine learning fairness works is that it generates and trains classifiers. If we think of AI as this large circle, then machine learning would be this like subset of artificial intelligence. And now it's actually probably the majority of artificial intelligence in its applicable use. And the way that this system works is that Google has an army of employees doing things like reporting your tweets or reporting your YouTube comments as inappropriate, so on and so forth, and also rating stories in terms of fake news. And after a while, they generate this pile of training data. And what Google does is they take that training data, they run it through machine learning fairness. Machine learning fairness then generates what's called a classifier. That classifier is then trained on that one bit of input. So you can take novel input like an article and you can run it through a trained classifier. It will tell you between 0 and 1 how likely this article contains hate speech, or whether it's right-wing content or left-wing content or political news or sports or whatever. And these classifiers are being used across all of Google, Google Search, Google News, and also on YouTube. And YouTube was the company that I worked at for the final 3 years of my time at Google. And what I saw was a matrix of machine learning classifiers that were being run on every single video that you uploaded. A lot of you will realize, oh my gosh, as soon as I upload a video, it gets demonetized. How did they know? It was machine learning fairness. They transliterate your video into a text file. They data mine it and they feed it through these classifiers. And when a classifier triggers, like, oh my gosh, this person said, vaccine or whatever, then boom, that's it. And the thing is that because this is what's so good about these machine learning classifiers is that you can't inspect them. You can't audit them. It's just a crazy network of stuff. And so if you ever bring them into court and you're like, they're essentially like, oh no, it's just this network of nodes. Guess what? You're SOL. You can't do discovery in court. And this is the perfect cover that they have. And this is how they censor America today.
That is visceral. And Glenn Greenwald actually alluded to that earlier, which was he got censored at his own organization for just being critical of Joe Biden right ahead of the 2020 elections. And so if we're doing this algorithmically via an AI, right, that thing is so much more powerful than any of us as individuals, and it will just outplay us. And what you're effectively saying is that Google basically decides what people can and cannot think rather than allow individuals to make decisions and conclude things for themselves based on what they see.
Yep. And it's an existential problem.
It is totally existential.
Mm-hmm. They want themselves to be able to set the narrative. They don't want the people themselves setting the narrative, which contradicts the whole name, YouTube. Now it's their tube.
That's right. My content is your content. Yeah. Right there. So we're going to bring on Shiv Malik, who is on with you and I, Zach, on the next panel for our conversation about free thought. So yeah, let's please bring on Shiv Malik, who's here right now. Zach, I believe we have given a sufficient intro and background about yourself. But Shiv, he's been he was previously at The Guardian for 5 years and has been an investigative journalist for another 15, or a total of 15 years. And he's moved on to working in the Web3 space, entering crypto as part of Golem, and now he has actually started his own foundation. So yeah, welcome, Shiv. Maybe
Hi.
I haven't done you great justice in introing you, so maybe you could fill in the rest.
Yeah, I can give it a little bit of background. So in regards to this very broad topic, then I guess, I've had plenty of whistleblowers come to me. I've protected, thankfully, all of them. I've even though the British government has launched in one case an investigation against who my sources were inside government. I've also fought a whistleblower or sort of source protection case against the Greater Manchester Police in a separate thing, and the British government as well. I managed to almost win that. It was a mixed result, but there you go. I tried. It's always difficult to do these things, and obviously, as an investigative journalist, then the things that I'm investigating were largely in and around terrorism, some stuff on economics, but speaking to ISIS and Al Qaeda, or digging up documents on them and trying to figure out exactly what was going on and exposing, I think, what I believed what was going on. And actually, Zach, you raised a really interesting point about that Hillary Benghazi story. I did some work on that. It didn't actually get published, but it did get published for the New York Times in the end. Unfortunately, it was actually one of the reasons I left The Guardian, because this investigation didn't go through. But the story isn't quite as you said, right? The beginning part is right? And this is what was going on, I'll tell you, because I met the people and spoke to them on the ground, right? Which, it's me telling you this. You might not believe it, but there we go. What happened was it was simple corruption, right? From the Jordanian. So the CIA were giving weapons to the Jordanians to pass to the rebels in Syria. And what the Jordanians were doing is this very specific unit in the secret police they were taking those weapons, and guess what? They were selling them. And they were selling them on the black market in Jordan. And those included a whole set of, small arms, including missile launchers. And one of them, in this case, the one that I know about anyway, ended up getting into their hands. It was I think it was a Mach 11 machine gun, got into the hands of an ISIS operative and ended up killing someone on a US base, right? A US soldier. And that's what prompted an FBI investigation, and they saw the serial number. So this may be well related to the exact case that you said. But that's how it got out. And what happened is that the Jordanian government hushed it up until it was exposed by the New York Times that that's what they had done, because the Jordanian government can't, unfortunately, admit corruption within themselves, because it had gone up to the king, and the king had known about the corruption and hushed it up. And then that's the whole story, right? So it didn't have anything to do with Hillary, but it did have everything to do with quite otherwise seemingly banal things like humans wanting more cash because they wanted to live better lifestyles, so they didn't care where weapons went. And if it killed a few American soldiers along the way, who cares, right? So it's that, I think the stuff that you raise is really fascinating, right? A lot of it is horrifying in the sense that we have huge capitalist organizations, just a handful of them, who do control the narrative, right? I think the failure here is one of capitalism rather than just simply of free speech or politics, right? That's the weird, peculiar part. These are private companies we're talking about, and they've done everything that, in a sense, are being asked of by their shareholders: make more money, right? Many of these censorship exercises happen because Google doesn't commercially want these people around, right? There's a whole slew of that, right? We'll just shut your company down, right? We'll shut your SEO search down because you could be a competitor to us, right? That's not the same as we don't like your speech. I'm not saying that the examples you raised are that, but actually a lot more censorship happens on that basis. than on we don't like your politics, right? Which is more worrying, but actually far more minor in example, right? They're shutting down whole industries because they're like, oh, look, we're going to build that, bring out a travel app, right? Or our own Google Flights, right? So during that process, the SEO went down for the rest of the travel industry. Why? Well, is that also censorship, or is the driver for that making money for Google, right? And I'd argue it would be, in that sense, the latter. There's also a few other issues I'd raise on that basis, which is, it's that nexus between, if you want, truth versus viable skepticism, of which there's plenty around, right? It's a good moment in history to be a skeptic because there's a lot that's going on that's really strange and not right and doesn't seem to add up. And I say that obviously with being an investigative journalist. It turns out there are real conspiracies out there, right? It's worth remembering the root, the etymology of the word conspiracy comes from the Greek, which is simply to breathe together, right? So it's truth versus viable skepticism versus just plain wrong. Sometimes people just get it wrong, right? Versus malicious lies, of which there are also many, many lies, right? But malicious lies, I'd also add in, scams. So if you come from crypto, you know just how many scams there are out there, right? People will pay Google to advertise a website that looks almost like the one that you're trying to get to. And if you click on it and you then connect your wallet to it and do X, Y, and Z, you'll lose all your money, right? Google makes money out of that. Right? They're like, hey, it's just all fair and love and war. Just do your own research, right? Oh, you didn't miss the extra I in, Uniswap? Well, tough, right? You've lost $50,000. Well, we made our, $50,000 at our end. That's on you. Is that right? Right? Is that right? Is that censorship to stop a scam? Right? It is. I think under your, version of what censorship is, it would be a scam. It would be censorship to stop someone from advertising their product in that way. Perhaps, but maybe that's the question I should put to you. Would that also count or not?
I mean, I think that you can solve that without using censorship. You can have ratings that get placed onto websites, community warnings. And I think that the censorship issue that we're facing is, I'm actually not against censorship in all its forms. I'm against the centralization of censorship. I think that censorship actually can be executed very effectively through decentralization, right? So, for example, replace the censors at Google with the censors of the users themselves, right? Like, let the users say, hey, this is, misinformation. Now, is that a perfect system? No, it's not. But it is the democratization and it is the decentralization, and it does reduce all the friction associated with most of the censorship, because instead of saying, well, you guys are ideologically based, you in the Citadel, instead, if you push it to the edges, then it's more of the cultural, it reflects the culture. And then, Russia can have their own version of censorship, they've got their own history, the United States can have their own thing. And then what you have is you've got social media that is tailored to the regions of which it exists in.
So, I mean, that's a whole other point, right? Which is, it turns out, a terrorist in, let's say, just pick Iran, or even Turkey, right? It's just not a terrorist in, let's say, the UK, right? They're like, oh, they're a freedom fighter, right? Classic problem. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that takes us off perhaps into the censorship of not just words and articles and those kinds of things, or videos, but also of code and money transactions and simple machine messages, right? Which are also up for grabs in this world of censorship. So we could talk about that. And I've fought very hard to ensure, along with a bunch of other people, that, there was a moment in which Ethereum and Layer 0, people were advocating that, it became legal, and therefore would be totally censorable ultimately by powers that be, because you could put pressure on those centralized parties who would represent Ethereum in a legal space. But I wanted to bring it back. Do you think the main driver in this is, because you can't get around the fact that and I don't disagree with you on that decentralized vision, right? Wikipedia is maybe a reasonable example of something like that, of a sort. But is the driver here capitalism, right? That's the interesting thing for me. These are private companies. Google is a huge monopoly. It's a monopoly because and it enforces its monopoly because it makes more money than anyone, right? So it keeps buying up other people and shutting them down, as you mentioned, is one great tactic, and other things. But do you think the driver is capitalism, or just like because they're liberals and they have a liberal bias? And I'm happy to concede that they do have a liberal bias.
Right.
I haven't.
Well, I think that there's a true dialectic, and then I think that there's a fake dialectic. And I think that the true dialectic is centralization versus decentralization. And that sort of fight has been, I mean, you can go to the Bible and read, Genesis 47, you're going to see that it's that Joseph, who, sorry if you guys are Christians, he was like Dr. Fauci and a whole bunch of other people wrapped up into one. It's mind-blowing. And they were centralizing power from the Canaanites and the Egyptians to the Pharaoh. And obviously this is something that they fight against. And throughout history, what you see is this great fight between the people that are saying, we want to decentralize power, right? We don't want you to tax us and bring it into a centralized authority so that you can conduct wars of empires. And instead of having that sort of, real historical representation of what history has actually been, what we get is we get this thing, this fight, left versus right, or capitalism versus socialism. And, if you look at it under that lens, that sort of, what's the solution if capitalism goes away? It's the socialism, like a complete centralization of power, which in my, opinion is
I don't
worse.
agree with that, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm not a socialist. I'm a mutualist, a corporativist. Ethereum is also a very cooperative system. And that's where I'm coming. I'm not coming from like, let's go to socialism because capitalism bad, because look at this. Right. So this is not some quick, weird, quickie argument. I'm just trying to identify the problem here.
Right.
Which is,
well, in my opinion, it's centralized capitalism is the same as socialism, and it's just equally as bad. And the solution isn't to get rid of capitalism. The solution is to have a decentralized form of capitalism, which is essentially what this country was founded on, and return power back to the people. And if you get rid of capitalism, then essentially what you're doing is you're getting rid of private property, and then you're giving it all to an all-powerful state. And we know, from the body count what that's going to entail. So
there's been a sort of perversion of the word capitalism. So because at the very fundamental level, capitalism is just a means of transacting in a free market. So it's just a means of exchange that is sort of a evolution of the barter economy. So on the flip side of that would be socialism, where there is one centralized power that controls the means of exchange amongst individuals that are participating in the global economy. So that's kind of the definition of capitalism that I'm working on. And so the sort of perversion in government and how private companies have gotten to where they are today in the US especially, I think could be attributed to the centralization of power by the government. Well, what we've seen very recently with the economic lockdowns was that, federal government instigated something like that, and then it just decimated small businesses, and it drove all consumer demands to companies like Amazon. And so there's just a substantial amount of accountability that the federal government has to take, and not sort of blame it on this, nebulous word like capitalism, which in effect is just a means of exchange between individuals.
But okay, so 2 points coming out might be one, like, okay, look, Google's a private company. Why we should be, as let's say we're capitalists, we should give them all the kudos that they deserve, right? Like they can do what they want on their platform. Why do we expect more from them in a sense, right? Like they don't come into, I mean, they do come into our house and tell us what to do, but in a sense by choice, right? Like people will rightly argue, look, they've done well. Like they can do what they want. It's their platform. Why do you think it was yours? Like you got suckered thinking it was like YouTube. That's just clever marketing, right? No? Or am I wrong?
I mean, they've got total immunity, right? Like that, they've got fascistic. I mean, in fascism, you see companies get immunity from whatever they do. And essentially, Google is enjoying this sort of fascistic immunity from prosecution. And as a result, the market's getting completely distorted by the fact that you can't sue them for, false advertising. I'm like, there should be a stockholder revolt where they said, no, you guys on IPO day said that this was going to be your constitution. You said you wouldn't be doing these things. And now look, you're producing the worst case scenario. We're going to sue you for destroying your business model, threatening, the fiduciary responsibility that you have to your stockholders. And we can't do that. Right. And so I feel that
America is a land of lawsuits. I'm sure if there was a lawsuit there, a lawyer would have taken it up.
No, they all get thrown out. So. Look, what Google does, and look, I've raised money for a lawsuit, punchgoogle.com, and what I learned in raising that is essentially that they have stipulated in their end user license agreement that if you're going to sue Google, you got to do it in their rigged California courts. All right. And Trump's latest class action lawsuit in Florida, they were like, hey, look, I live in Florida and I'm getting harmed in Florida. And we want to sue you in Florida. And the judge said, oh, sorry. No, there's a jurisdictional clause in the end user license agreements. We got to go to California. And so the problem is that all these different perverse corruptions have been entangled in this debate about, why Google is doing what they've done. And if we could have a restored legal system, and a functioning legal system, then I think that we would be in a much different place than we are today. I think that Google would be slapped down. And then essentially, once they lose in a lawsuit, I think that the ambulance chasing lawyers would just do most of the work for us. And, in taking this company and saying, oh, you're engaging in torturous interference between parties that are trying to mutually consent to do business.
So, okay, here's maybe a more it's a different problem, but like a one that's maybe a little harder to work out because you kind of work out what's true or not, right? Mm-hmm. And that's always a difficult thing. And let's say I go on the internet and I say, I'm selling rabbit liver tablets, right? Just random thing, right? But they can cure muscular dystrophy. You don't know if that's true, right? And no one else does, let's say, except for a bunch of people who've actually studied this for a very long time. And they say, you know what, that isn't true at all. And I'm making money from this, right? I'm like happy to sell my rabbit liver. I believe in it genuinely, right? Modernity is really complicated. This is, I think, the fundamental problem, right? People barely grasp how their car works, but they certainly don't know how it's put together. And they couldn't tell you, and they couldn't sit there making their own car most of the time. And then you get something more complicated like medicine, and there's even smaller numbers of people who actually know what are going on. And that means that you have to trust other people. And that's the difficult part, right? Because you're like, well, why should I trust this guy who happens to have expertise in X, Y, and Z? Like, who is he, right? But he's got that person, he or she has a decent basis for making a better judgment than you do. And that's the system that's sort of broken down. But what would you do would you stop me? I believe in my rabbit liver tablets.
No, I absolutely.
It's a real thing.
I would absolutely not stop you. And the reason why is because we already have a solution for this. We've got influencers that are rising up, right? Like, if
I start paying off influencers to support me? Because that happens, right? All the time.
It happens all the time with the FDA, and that's the centralized corruption that we see. But the thing is that with this bottom up sort of credentialing, I'll give you a great example. Dr. Berg, he has totally changed my life. He's not even a medical doctor. He's
take my example, because this the one that's on the table, right? I go and I say, hey, yeah, you're right. I need more influencers. So I pay a bunch of people who are like, yeah, sure, I think it works. I spoke to the guy and he seems really honest, right?
Yeah, but you wouldn't be able to pay off Dr. Berg. And that's the guy that I listen to. And he's highest
so that rated one guy. All right. Yeah. So there'll always be in a system someone you really trust. That's the beauty of a decentralized system.
The crux of this question is whether or not an individual should be responsible for coming to their own conclusions, or if that responsibility should be outsourced to an authority figure like the state. And I think the point of this summit is the fact that individuals should be able to look at all the information that's available to them and for them to draw something that's decently reasonable.
I agree with that, but the problem is that the point that I raised, which is that it turns out doing your own research, it only works for a really small minority of people when it comes to really complicated things, because they can't do their own research because it's too complicated. And it's interesting. I'll take it back to the tech example, and when they did the Ethereum sale of tokens, they gave it to people who understood Ethereum code. That basically, right? And those number of people were tiny and at first, and that made sense because they got it, they were working on it mainly, and they understood what was going on. That number of people has grown, but if you ask anyone how the Solidity smart contract works, they won't be able to tell you. I worked in it for 4 years. I can't code, so I can't tell you really how a Solidity smart contract works. I could try, right? Now, so how are people really supposed to discern whether, in this example, rabbit liver tablets really do cure muscular dystrophy? And there's literally tens of thousands of those issues around in a given day for a person, right? And if you've got a kid who's got muscular dystrophy, it's an important problem to resolve. Where do you go?
Social media solves this problem because someone
does it make it worse?
No, it makes it better because what they can do is that the person with the convincing argument gets more likes, and the algorithms that feed into that boost up the content more. And you can look at what other people think in terms of what they like about a content producer, and you can pretty much delegate it out to that. And you say,
who's really good at that sort of thing as well is ISIS recruiters. I watch them do this really well, right? They have excellent arguments for joining ISIS. They really do. And they're convinced, right? I watch them recruit loads of people. I don't agree with ISIS ideology, but they have some really good points. Let me just put it, and they source it from the Quran, and they're like X, Y, and Z. And they're also like, hey, look, you can see what's going on socioeconomically, and come over and fight for your brotherhood, right? They were all over Twitter, all over YouTube in 2012, 2013. I spent ages uncovering those people and going, oh my God, this guy he lives down the road from me, right? He lives, an hour and a half drive. He's not in Syria at all, right? But he's really good at sending young, impressionable males over. Now, they did their own research. They did. Those people got a lot of likes. They were trusted, right? What do you do, right? Is it on YouTube to say, maybe that's not something we want on our platform?
Well, to some degree, there is going to be propaganda no matter what. But to some degree, we do have to believe in the intelligence of individual people for them to make reasonable decisions for themselves, because they know best what's best for themselves, right? So if it's something like what rabbit liver tablets, it's up to them to research on the internet. The entire premise of the cryptocurrency space is do your own research and not your keys, not your coins. If people had listened to influencers or figures of authority in 2012, they would have never gotten into Bitcoin because they would have thought of it as an anti-money or a money laundering currency. I wouldn't have gotten into it, had I thought that I had to have 100% of the information about how Bitcoin or UTXOs worked. But no, it was more of, I collected certain data points and figured that this is going to be the future of the financial internet in 2014. I didn't need to appeal to an influencer or whatever. Influencers are actually, behind the curve. And so is social media. And so, individuals who are ahead of the curve can make certain decisions for themselves based on doing their own research.
I mean, look, I'm all for doing your own research because that's literally what my job was for a decade and a half, right? And that's what I did. I was like, I'm going to investigate for myself. And then I happened to get paid for that, which is really nice. I got a license to ask questions. But I had humility, right? I was like, I don't know the answers to this. And actually other people do. I'll ask them, which is, I guess, maybe part of the process, right, of doing your own research. But I think that, is there a way of marrying, and this is the question to Zach, that decentralized vision, which really appeals to me. And I think, as I said, Wikipedia is a decent example of that, right? People complain about it all the time, but nevertheless, it turns out it's still a bit of a closed system, right? There are selected people, and it's really hard to find out and really hard to get in, and but once you're in, and like, who are these moderators anyway, right? But it's a decent example of that. How do you marry that decentralized network with for kind of truth and veracity with the complicated nature of modernity, right? And you take it up a notch, right? Apply that to
there's so many presumptions that you have in there in your thing. Look, the problem with modernity is that they don't release their formula. Their RNA sequence is secret, and it's one of the 4 mandated vaccines that we have here in.
Oh no, I don't mean Moderna. I mean literally modernity, as in like the world in which we live in right now is very complicated. It's not as easy as it was to figure out. Like a horse and cart's easy to figure out. A car's more complicated. Electric car's way more complicated, and people need to use those things now, right? Mm-hmm. And figuring out how vaccines work is always been hard, and people have never trusted those things, it turns out. But life is more complicated ever than it was, right? It's like a fundamental philosophical problem with how we live now. So I don't mean Moderna.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. Right, so, we've got 2 minutes and 20 seconds left. So
you're not going to answer that.
I'm going to answer this as quickly as possible. There's basically 2 facets of human psychology I want to talk about. One is René Girard. He was a philosopher. His thesis on Memetic Desire. And essentially, people are herd animals. And we go towards the herd. And we want to see what the other people are doing. And this top-down bureaucracy that we've had for the last 120 years basically manufactured this herd mentality of like, hey, look, like everyone else is doing it, so that's the right opinion to have. And that's the reason why social media is so important, is because it allows this top-down bureaucracy of, hey, this is the person that you're listening to and everyone else is listening to it. It has this bottom-up of, hey, the algorithm is amplifying people of which they have high engagement, and that feedback cycle goes and raises those people up. And then people say, hey, I'm going to listen to this guy because his video is getting 150,000 views. And this is so destabilizing to the entire system that YouTube is basically like, no, we're going to have to put our fingers on the scale now and say that if we don't like the content that you're saying, that you've got to go away. And the reason why they're doing this is because they don't want the contradictions to their misinformation. And this is the problem, the existential problem that we find ourselves, where true information is actually being suppressed, because what people are doing is that they're delegating their thought processes to people that they trust. And when they actually have this trust relationship with an influencer, that influencer doesn't want to knowingly lie to them, because that's going to destroy their own reputation with these people, and then their engagement is going to decrease across these platforms. And so really, it's these social media systems that are actually creating the disruption that fixes the problem of corruption in these centralized authorities. And we just got to trust, that people know what they're doing. And if there's a problem with misinformation, then the solution to that is more information. It's the same thing that Eric Schmidt said. He said the fix for bad speech is more speech, and I couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. And thank you, Zach, so much for circling back on the theme of free speech. We are currently out of time. Thank you guys, Shiv and Zach, for coming on. This has been a great, turns out to be a debate, but excellent conversation, excellent discourse. Great on both sides and having different perspectives on this is the whole idea of this summit. And, we'll open it up to the next speaker, which is, I believe, Matthew Zipkin.